Hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing great today. So today we have another talk in the machine learning in neuroscience series. So I'm Robert Boshra. I'm the stream owner for this series. And just for everybody tuning in this time, so this is part of ACE, and this is where it's a community to get great speakers to talk about different aspects of machine learning, and we put it on YouTube repository for after, so that everybody can consume the content afterwards. So today I am very pleased and excited to welcome our speaker, Darinka Trübutschek, and let me introduce her here. So Darinka is currently a postdoctoral fellow with Dr. Mark Stokes at the University of Oxford. Her main research interest lies in dissecting the neurocognitive architecture of working memory, our brain's ability to store and manipulate information in the service of adaptive, flexible, and intelligent behavior. To this end, she employs a mixture of behavioral techniques, neuroimaging, as in functional magnetic resonance imaging, fMRI, and electrophysiological methods like intracranial EEG and MEG, as well as machine learning algorithms. Prior to her work in Oxford, as part of her PhD with Stanislas Dehaene in Paris, Darinka explored the cognitive and neural characteristics and features of a newly discovered phenomenon called the non-conscious working memory. When she's not in the lab, she enjoys cooking and eating dishes from different cultures and cuisines, listening and playing music on the recorder or guitar, and traveling to foreign cities and countries. So again, I am very happy to have Darinka today. And for everybody on the chat, I'm going to be your conduit for all the comments and questions. So please send them over on the chat, and I'll make sure that we get a time to answer them. So without much delay, on to you.
Thanks. I'm super excited to be here today. I hope that the internet connection will now remain stable. We've had some issues before. But yeah, as I said, I'm really super excited to be here today. I think this is a very exciting format. I hope to learn a lot from you guys, because I come more from the cognitive neuroscience side than from the machine learning side, so to speak. But I still hope that I can, tell you a little bit about how we can use machine learning to try to decode our conscious and non-conscious thoughts. And I really want to talk about some work that I did as part of my PhD with Stanislas Dehaene, which, as Robert has already pointed out, essentially looks at trying to study a new working memory system, namely non-conscious working memory. And so I hope that everyone can see my screen, right? And I haven't cut out. But in any case, before I get into the actual details of the study, I just want to make sure that we're all on the same page. And I want to take a little bit of time to talk about consciousness and how consciousness can actually be a scientifically tractable problem to study in a scientifically rigorous fashion. Because we all have some sort of ideas when it comes to consciousness, but very little people actually think that this, or comparatively fewer people think that this is a rigorous cognitive function to study. So basically, what we need first is obviously to define our terminology, to have an operationalization of the concept that it is that we're talking about. So when we talk about consciousness, we can think of it in a two-dimensional space, if you will. One of the dimensions is your level of consciousness, your arousal or vigilance, and that basically varies from a comatose state over something like deep and light sleep up to fully conscious state. Okay? The other dimension, and this is the dimension that I'm actually interested in and that I'm going to be talking about some more today, is what we can refer to as conscious access. And this is basically just the content of your current consciousness. So for example, when you look at this image that I'm showing over here, some of you may see a man playing a saxophone, while others may focus more on this woman's face that you see over here. And so as time progresses, your perception is likely going to fluctuate between these two different percepts. And so what I'm really interested in is to try to understand the brain mechanisms that give rise to these fluctuating conscious perceptions that we have, while the physical input image is being kept exactly the same. So what I'm going to be talking about today is really conscious axes. And there is a whole separate literature on arousal and vigilance, for instance, that I'm not going to be touching. We also need experimental paradigms to be able to specifically manipulate this cognitive function that we're all interested in, which in this case is consciousness. And so I'm just going to be giving you a brief overview over some of the techniques that we may use in our field. All of which have one thing in common, which is essentially that the only thing that we try to manipulate is your conscious perception of a given input. We, however, want to keep the physical input that our brain perceives or receives constant, independent of your conscious perception. And so over the past couple of decades, there have been a number of paradigms that allow us to do exactly this, and then to essentially get to a minimal contrast between consciously perceived and consciously not perceived images, if you will. So the first technique that we can use is something that we refer to as masking. And in this case, you just imagine that we present a target stimulus. In this case, it's the word radio, and we surround it temporally and spatially with another pattern. In this case, it's just an overlapping pattern of shapes. And if we titrate this carefully enough, what will happen is that on certain trials, subjects will be able to clearly see this stimulus, radio, while on other trials, they won't. And so over time, we arrive at basically just manipulating your conscious perception without changing any of the physical input that your brain receives. Another way of accomplishing pretty much the same thing is to use paradigms that rely on the attentional blink. So what happens here is that we rapidly present a series of stimuli. In this case, it's numbers, and we can embed different targets in this stream of numbers. In this case, it's letters. So the subject has to make a response whenever there is a letter that is being presented. And yeah. And what happens is that subjects typically perceive the first target without any issues. However, as you vary the temporal distance, the lag between target 1 and target 2, subjects become less and less likely to actually perceive target 2. So if target 1 and target 2 are very close, temporally speaking, in time, so with just like 100 milliseconds or so temporal distance, subjects will be much less likely to perceive target 2 than target 1. And so their perception of target 2 will also fluctuate. And then a third kind of paradigm that I just want to briefly mention is called binocular rivalry. And here the idea is basically that we present two different images to your two different eyes, which is usually achieved with some sort of specialist goggles. And surprisingly, what happens is not that your brain perceives a fused image of these two separate images, but instead that your perception is once again going to fluctuate between the separate images. So in this case, at some point, you would be seeing a face, and at other times, you would be seeing a house. Okay? And so once we have these minimal experimental paradigms to manipulate conscious perception, we then have to pair it with a careful quantification of your actual subjective perception. There are different ways in which this can be done. Some people opt to have more objective measures to study conscious perception, but we personally think that conscious perception is a subjective phenomenon, so we like to ask our subjects directly whether or not they perceived a given percept. So basically, at the end of every trial, we're going to ask our subjects, did you see or did you not see the preceding stimulus? And then this gives us the possibility to sort our trials based on subjective report, which then, allows us to contrast trials in which a subject perceived a given percept with those in which he or she did not perceive the same percept. And then, since we're also all interested in the neural correlates of conscious access and conscious perception, we tend to pair these paradigms with measures of brain activity. Now, if you were particularly interested in the spatial arrangement and which brain areas particularly contribute to conscious perception, then perhaps you may rely on a technique that you're probably familiar with, such as functional MRI. But I'm more interested in the evolution and dynamics of brain activity over time. So I tend to rely on techniques such as EEG or MEG, and more recently also intracranial recordings. And then last but not least, and you know much more about this than I do, but the last key ingredient that really has helped us to learn a lot more about conscious perception in the past couple of years is the fact that we can now use machine learning algorithms to really track mental representations in the brain as they evolve dynamically over time. And so if you imagine that we present our subject with this kind of attentional blink paradigm that I've mentioned before, and we record a brain activity pattern at each time point. So I should probably mention, when we tend to record brain activity, we record it at about 1,000 hertz. So we get one measurement, or a measurement of whole brain activity at each millisecond. So that's quite a high temporal resolution. And so then what we can do is to train a pattern classifier at each time point to separate our trials based on any experimental condition that we're interested in. So in this case, we may train our pattern classifier to separate trials based on whether or not target 2 was seen or not seen, right? We do this for every time point, and then we can assess the performance of this classifier on left out trials or another data set, and test its ability to predict the label seen or unseen, not only at the same time point, but also for all other time points. And this is... Oh, sorry, yes. Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, okay. Yeah, I guess I can try. Is this better? Okay, yeah. Sorry. No worries. So, yes. So basically, as I've said, this basically then results in a generalization matrix where on the y-axis you have training time, on the x-axis you have testing time or generalization time. And this is actually gives us important information about the underlying process, about the underlying cognitive process that may have been involved in solving the current task. For example, you may imagine that there are neural processes that are sustained over time. And in this case, you may expect the pattern classifier to that was trained at time point t0 to perform equally well at time point tn, and this would then result in such a square generalization matrix. And there are many other different processes that we may uncover this way, but another important sort of pattern that may emerge is this chain-like or diagonal decoding, which basically means that this function was solved by a metastable chain, if you will, of different brain patterns. And so, having employed these kind of techniques over the past couple of decades and years, we've actually been able to learn a lot about how the functional properties as well as the neural properties of conscious perception in the human brain. And obviously, I don't have the time to go about, to cover the entire literature, but I just want to highlight some important findings that are important for the studies that we carried out later on. The first one being that access to consciousness permits the maintenance of information as well as the maintenance of neural processes. That basically means that non-conscious stimuli do affect our behavior. So for example, if we do these kinds of masking paradigms that I've talked about previously, and the subject has to do an objective task with respect to the masked target, they are going to perform above chance even for unseen trials, but these effects are very short-lived in time, so in the order of a couple hundred milliseconds. By contrast, we all know that once we've consciously perceived a given stimulus, we can store this information for pretty much however long we want, as long as we rehearse and repeat it, I guess. And this also means that the associated neural processes decay much more quickly for non-conscious than for conscious stimuli. Furthermore, non-conscious processes may occur in parallel, but conscious perception in and of itself is serial and capacity limited, which I think we've all also experienced. It's very difficult to do more than one thing at a given time. We can switch between doing different things, we can alternate between tasks, but typically we tend to be focused on a very limited number of thoughts at any given time, which is due to the fact that there is a bottleneck when it comes to conscious perception. Also important is the fact that the contents of consciousness may be manipulated and reported. So if I asked you right now to tell me what exactly it is that you're conscious of, you would probably be able to give me a very good description of that. While just by the pure definition of it, you would not be able to do so about the non-conscious processes that are currently going on in your brain. And then last but not least, I also want to point out that a lot of research has been done on non-conscious processes, and virtually any brain area may be involved in non-conscious processing, which is what you see in this little figure here. It doesn't really matter what exactly has been studied in these different studies that I'm showing you here, but this is just to show that basically the entire brain is involved in non-conscious processing. However, when it then comes to conscious processing, what happens, or one of the big theories in consciousness research suggests that in order for a stimulus to be consciously processed, we need a metastable ignition of brain activity in specifically a frontoparietal network, which is located somewhere over here and here. And that basically means, these are simulated data, this basically means that as a stimulus becomes more or more conscious, there are going to be differences in brain activity later on in time, so around 300 milliseconds or so, but also the higher you go up in the cortical hierarchy, right?
So sorry to interrupt here, but I
Yeah.
think the slides are not updating on the screen.
Oh, really?
I'm stuck here on slide number 14.
Okay, I'm showing 15. So what does that mean? I can go back.
Maybe we could just try to reshare the screen, just to
Okay.
update and refresh that.
Yes. Sorry.
No, no,
So
that's
I
fine.
stop presenting and then I go back. Okay. Okay. Can you see slide 15 now?
Yep, this is good.
Okay.
Thank you.
Perfect. Okay. So yes. So basically, yeah, this is what I just said. So when you simulate data with varying strengths of conscious perception, if you will, you'll see that in early visual areas there's very little, if any, difference in brain activity. But the later in time you go and the higher in the cortical hierarchy we go, the more likely you are to see differences that are specifically associated just with conscious processing. Okay, and so for those of you, I don't know how many cognitive neuroscientists there are in the audience, but for those of you who are familiar with other cognitive processes in the brain, this may sound very similar to another cognitive function, which is working memory. So working memory is basically just another type of short-term memory that is very important in situations in which you try to keep track of a current goal and do sort of different tasks in between to reach this current goal. So for example, when you're doing a difficult mental or arithmetic problem, or you're trying to read a paragraph and you have to keep in mind what you've already read, or when you're trying to follow a recipe, these are all situations in which you would be using your working memory. And so what we've learned in the past about working memory is that working memory also, since it's a memory, permits the maintenance of information, but is actually also associated with persistent and sustained neural firing, so the maintenance of neural processes. Similarly, working memory is also capacity limited, and importantly, the contents of working memory may also be manipulated, hence the name working memory, and reported. And just like conscious perception, working memory also primarily relies on activity in a distributed frontal-parietal network. Now, given these similarities between working memory and conscious perception, then it's not very surprising that one very pervasive assumption in our field is that conscious perception and working memory are actually two very closely related cognitive functions. So, for example, working memory is typically conceptualized to store and operate on consciously represented information. And so this assumption is really very pervasive in our field. I don't have the time to go into the details, but a lot of the theories in conscious perception and working memory draw on concepts from the other cognitive function. They're sort of intertwined, but up until very recently, this assumption has never been empirically tested. So needless to say, we were all very surprised when a couple of years back, David Soto and his colleagues came up with a great behavioral paradigm that essentially questioned a lot of the things that I've told you up until now. And in particularly, it questioned that conscious perception and working memory are actually as closely related to each other as we may have thought, and that non-conscious stimuli are very short-lived in their effects on behavior. And so essentially what they suggested is that there may be a non-conscious working memory system. So conscious perception and working memory can be fully dissociated, if you will. The way they set about to test this is basically by combining a masking paradigm with the typical working memory paradigm. So the subject was being shown an oriented grating that they had to remember, and then this grating was masked, and sometimes they would perceive the stimulus, sometimes they would not perceive the stimulus. But after a very long delay of, I think, up to 5 seconds, which are not the typical delays we use in consciousness research, subjects were being shown a test grating, and then they had to decide whether or not the memory grating was flipped clockwise or counterclockwise with respect to this test grating. And so if you believe in anything that I've said up until this point, then you may think that subjects obviously should not be able to perform this task above chance when they had not seen this memory cue. But what David and his colleagues showed is that actually consistently over a series of behavioral experiments, subjects performed a little better than would have been predicted by chance alone. So chance is 50%, and you can see here that subjects performed between 55 and 60% or so. And so they then took this behavioral evidence of this long-lasting blindside effect to suggest that indeed working memory and conscious perception can be dissociated, and there could be something that we call a non-conscious working memory. And so this is when we really got interested into this phenomenon, because we thought it was an interesting paradigm, but we weren't very convinced by the interpretation of the data, because we thought there are alternative hypotheses that can explain this very little long-lasting blindside effect without necessarily invoking the necessity of having a new working memory system. And one possibility, for example, is that since subjects are being asked about their visibility of the memory grating, that perhaps on a small number of trials, a subset of trials, subjects basically just made an error when they gave a visibility response. So instead of having said that they saw the target, they said they didn't see the target, and then this would explain why they performed above chance on this number of trials. And then another explanation might be that after the presentation of this memory grating, subjects guessed the orientation of this grating and then held onto this guess consciously, and then essentially just compared the guess location to this test location. And this, of course, also does not involve non-conscious working memory, but simply a conscious maintenance of an early guess. And so we set out to develop a couple of paradigms that would help us tease apart these three possibilities. So a genuine non-conscious working memory versus any of these alternative hypotheses. And that, really helps us understand better the nature of this long-lasting blindside effect. So essentially what we ended up doing is develop a paradigm in which we present a target square. We flash this target square on the screen in one of 20, or depending on the experiment, 24 locations, and then we mask it. So across trials, sometimes subjects will perceive this target, sometimes they won't perceive it. And then after a long delay of 4 seconds, we ask subjects to identify the location of their target and also to rate the visibility of the target on a scale from 1 to 4. And 1 means that they didn't see the target, 2, 3, and 4 means they saw the target, but with a differing clarity, if you will. And while subjects performed this task, we also recorded MEG. So we recorded their brain responses as subjects were performing this task. Now, behaviorally, what we observed is that, as expected, when subjects saw the target, they were also very good at identifying its location, right? So you see here on the y-axis, proportion of trials, on the x-axis, the distance in degrees to the actual target location, and it's very clear when the subject saw the target, they also almost always chose the correct location. There's a little bit of a correlation such that with increasing visibility, they also had increasing accuracy. What we also observed, and what we really did not expect to find, is that even when subjects reported that they had not seen the target square, they still performed much better than chance. So remember David's study where chance was 50% and subjects performed around 55 to 60%? In our case, chance is 5%, but in 25% of the unseen trials, subjects still performed, still accurately chose the target location. And this is great because we were able to replicate David's findings, but of course, we're still in the same boat as he is, in that we don't know what the cause of this long-lasting blindside effect in our case is. Still, it could have been the result of them miscategorizing some of the visibility responses, or perhaps consciously holding on to an early guess, or alternatively, just non-conscious storage of information. And so basically,
so one quick question here.
yes.
So is that concept of unseen being able to predict the location of the square, was that consistent between the different subjects, or was it more diverse? Like some people were more accurate and had a stronger form of this non-conscious working memory, while others did not have it at all.
So so I should perhaps mention that so in order to achieve this fluctuating perception of the target, what we have to do is that we have to adjust the contrast of the mask per subject. And we do this in a separate calibration procedure with the aim that each subject sees about 50% of the target stimuli and they don't see the other 50%. And so overall, of course, there is a little bit of a variability in how well this calibration procedure worked for each subject. On average, our subjects did see about, as you can see here, 50% of the targets. But there were some subjects, who perhaps saw 70% and didn't see 30%. But it's been a while, so I don't want to make any claim that isn't true. But I know very well the vast majority of the subjects, I don't recall the exact numbers, but the vast majority of subjects all had a blindside effect here. And in fact, any of the subsequent analyses that I'm doing, I'm only doing on those subjects that, actually have a blindside effect. Because otherwise, yeah, that wouldn't be very informative. Yes, so you can go to the paper and check it out, but the vast majority did have a blindside effect here.
Excellent, thank you.
Cool. So then we have this behavioral result that basically replicates David's findings, but what we really want to do now is go to the MEG data and determine the nature of this long-lasting blindside effect. And so basically our strategy that we employed is very simple. What we try to do is that we try to identify a signature of conscious processing, a brain signature of conscious processing that is specific to the seen trials. And then we're going to evaluate whether or not this signature of conscious processing is also present on the unseen correct trials. so on our blindside trials. And this is what I'm showing you here. So it's just an oscillatory signature in the alpha and beta power, so between 8 and 30 hertz, if you will. And essentially what we observed is that whenever a subject saw a target in two different tasks, we had a control condition in which there was no working memory requirement, but subjects only rated the perception of the target. In two different tasks, we observed this very prominent desynchronization, so decrease in alpha and beta power after the presentation of the target in this set of frontocentral sensors. You see it over here, and you see that it's sustained over the entire epoch in the working memory task. What's important is that this signature is entirely absent in the unseen trials, and also in another control condition that we had in which we just didn't present any target. So the subject could not have seen a target, and they could also not have remembered a target. When we look at the topography of this effect, first of all, you will see that it's confined to these central frontal sensors and likely originates from parietal brain areas. And this is important because, as I've mentioned before, parietal cortex is involved in conscious perception, but also working memory. And so then it seems very likely that this sustained decrease in alpha and beta power really is a signature of conscious processing. And so now we're in a position to evaluate whether or not this signature of conscious processing is also present in our unseen correct trials. And this is what I'm showing you here in panel C. The first thing that you'll probably notice is that on the unseen correct trials, there is really nothing that would resemble this strong desynchronization that we observe for the seen trials. And moreover, and this is also important, there is really no difference between the unseen correct and the unseen incorrect trials, which clearly suggests that there is a clear distinction in the brain responses between the seen and the unseen correct trials. And as such, there is no evidence for either the miscategorization or the conscious maintenance hypothesis. And instead, it really seems to be the case as if there is genuine non-conscious storage of information. But while on the one hand great, on the other hand, this also put us in yet another pickle because, as I've mentioned in the beginning, one of the hallmark signatures of neural activity during working memory tasks is sustained activity, with the idea being that the representation that is stored in working memory is just continuously held online until it is no longer needed. And so the question then naturally arises, well, where and how in the brain is information on the unseen trials being maintained when there doesn't seem to be any sustained activity associated with it whatsoever? And so in our next set of analyses, what we try to do is specifically track the contents of conscious and non-conscious working memory across time. And so you can also do this in a multivariate sort of way, but what I'm presenting here is a univariate equivalent of these multivariate analyses, if you will, in that I'm essentially just doing a circular linear correlation between target location on the one hand and our MEG signal on the other hand. And I do this across trials and for each time point. And doing this across trials, you will see that there indeed seems to be a decodable representation of target location that emerges around 300 milliseconds after the target and is mainly confined to these posterior sensors. Now, when we split this as a function of visibility, in red we have the seen trials and in blue we have the unseen trials, you'll notice two things, I think. Or two things are to be noted, I guess. One of them is that early on in the epoch, so up until 1 second or so, both seen and unseen target locations can be decoded. You'll see it here, here, and not so much here. But, and importantly, they're decoded with similar levels of accuracy, which is important because, again, it suggests that the initial input that the brain received was similar for both the unseen and the seen trials. What happens afterwards is that brain activity diverges in the sense that for seen trials, while not sustained in a typical fashion, decodability of the target waxes and wanes, it comes back and disappears again, but overall it's present throughout the remainder of the epoch. And by contrast, for the unseen trials, there is really no activity whatsoever related to target location. It has completely vanished. And so, again, there seems to be a dissociation between the seen and the unseen trials, with seen target locations being maintained by sort of a mixture of neural activity and silent periods, while there is absolutely no information in neural activity for unseen target locations. And again, this was a bit of an issue because, as I've now mentioned multiple times, we actually would have expected to find some sort of neural activity that would code for target location, even in case of the unseen trials. Now, luckily for us, and I really don't have the time to go into the details right now, but we can talk about it later if you want, around the time that we were grappling with this problem, some theorists, Mongillo, Sodix, and Stokes, for example, suggested that perhaps we may not necessarily need neural activity to maintain information in working memory. This can also be achieved by what they term activity-silent mechanisms. And so we were in the position to be able to simulate and model our data using one of these new activity-silent mechanisms. And suffice it to say that these simulations showed that these activity-silent mechanisms may be a plausible neural correlate, specifically for non-conscious working memory maintenance. Okay? So what this study has basically shown so far is that the blindside effect is a genuine phenomenon. There really is non-conscious maintenance of information, and there seems to be an activity-silent mechanism that is associated with this. But what is entirely missing from this experiment so far is the working part of working memory. Now, I've said that both the contents of consciousness, but also the contents of working memory can be manipulated. And this is the essential part that makes working memory and not just any other type of short-term memory. And so this we wanted to assess in another project to see whether or not it's also possible to non-consciously manipulate information in working memory, because only then can we truly talk about a genuine non-conscious working memory. And so in order to do this, what we ended up doing is employ a very similar paradigm to the one that I've described to you so far, with the only difference being that now during the delay period, the subjects were instructed to perform one of three tasks. Either they had to report the original target location that was presented, or they had to report a rotated location. And this rotated location could either be rotated 120 degrees clockwise or counterclockwise. And so what we observed, I'm just checking that I actually have internet because I don't hear anything.
Yeah, we're good.
Okay, awesome, thank you. So what we observed in two independent behavioral experiments is once again that we were able to replicate this long-lasting blindside effect that we've talked about before. So when the subject simply had to report the original target location, they hadn't seen the target, they still performed much better than would have been predicted by chance over here. But this was also the case when they were being asked to rotate the location. So the effect is a bit smaller, but nonetheless significant and robust and replicable. And so this was very exciting because this was the first behavioral evidence that sort of showed that indeed non-conscious information may perhaps even be manipulated in a genuinely non-conscious fashion. However, just based on these behavioral data, we're of course in the very same boat that we were in before, which is that we cannot rule out that what we're looking at could be a potential miscategorization of the visibility responses or perhaps a conscious manipulation. So you may imagine that, for instance, subjects really didn't see the target at all. They waited, didn't know what to do until the cue told them what task exactly they would have to do. And around this time of the presentation of the cue, they would then essentially just guess the location of the target and then consciously rotate that target location. In which case, this would, of course, be a conscious manipulation and not a non-conscious manipulation. And so again, we had recorded MEG activity during this task in order to be able to tease apart these three different possibilities. And I'm going to go over this very quickly because we were essentially able to replicate our initial findings from the previous experiment, which showed that this long-lasting blindside effect in this task definitely does, or most likely does not arise from a miscategorization of scene trials. And the way we were able to assess this here is in two different ways. First, we can contrast brain activity on seen and unseen trials, which reveals typical signatures of neural processing, of conscious processing on the seen trials, which is specifically this amplification of brain activity that happens around 300 milliseconds and is referred to as the P3B. And we can also train a decoder to predict visibility, seen or unseen, across time. And you see that this decoder performs very well and is, able to make this distinction throughout the entire epoch, and also results in this typical sort of diagonal decoding, suggesting that, in conscious perception, we have a metastable chain of different cognitive processes. Now,
So quick question
yes,
on that. So when the decoder is sorting through the data, this is single trial
yes,
data, is that correct?
yes, yes,
Okay. And in that case, it's trained on single samples or time averaged time samples, and it's trained on one sample and then tested on a sample that is maybe shifted in time. Is that
yeah. So we essentially train each decoder on each time. We train a decoder on each time point, and then we test the decoder on that very same time point, but also on all other time points. And we do this with a cross-validation procedure. So I think for this particular project, we kept out 1/5 of the data during training, and then we assessed prediction performance on the left out part of the data. But yeah,
I
it's
see.
every time point. I think we may have downsampled the data beforehand to 200. Well, we for sure downsampled it to 250 hertz. So a time point corresponds to the integrated brain activity, if you will, over 4 milliseconds, but that's still quite fine temporal resolution. Yeah.
Excellent. So I got another question here. So is the data coming from all sensors, or is it source space, or like what is the data?
Yeah. So I'm doing, in this case, we're doing the decoding in sensor space, which in our case is 306 sensors, whole brain coverage. And I haven't done in the eLife paper, in the paper before, we did feature selection beforehand. I think I retained 50% of the most, in a univariate way, we did feature selection before we actually applied the decoding. But here, I think I just used all sensors, but it doesn't make any difference. So I
Great. Thank you.
Okay, cool. So so the takeaway message from this slide is essentially, okay, there are signatures of conscious processing in our data when we contrast seen with unseen trials. And importantly, these very same signatures of conscious processing are absent when we contrast unseen correct with unseen incorrect trials. So you see here the time courses for the unseen correct trials in light blue and for the unseen incorrect trials in dark blue. You see, first of all, they look very similar once more, and importantly, they're missing this amplification of brain activity that is typical for consciously perceived stimuli. And moreover, now if we train a decoder to separate the unseen trials based on their accuracy, this decoder performs around chance during the entirety of the epoch. It basically looks like a lot of noise. So again, we were able to replicate our findings from the previous study that the long-lasting blind side effect does not arise from a miscategorization of scene trials. However, this leaves us with two possibilities. One being that what we're looking at is a genuine non-conscious rotation of information. The other one being that we're looking at the conscious rotation of an early guess. And so in order to get at this question, we then also turned to another set of multivariate analyses of our data, with the idea being that, again, we want to track the different representations that subjects may have during the course of this task, starting with target location in scene trials. You see that we're able to decode target location very well throughout the entire epoch, right? On scene trials, this is not very surprising. On the unseen trials, we see a very similar picture to what we've seen previously, in that early on during the epoch, so before the presentation of the rotation cue, which happens here, we can decode unseen target locations transiently, but afterwards it vanishes again, and there is no signature that, you know, left that would tell us anything about target location on the unseen trials. Now, if our hypothesis, or if the hypothesis that subjects perhaps rotated a guess location is true, then perhaps what we may be able to do is actually be able to decode this guess location. And the guess location was essentially defined as taking the subject's response and then rotating it in the direction opposite to what that cue had instructed the subject to do on that particular trial. So if the subject had seen a target and then they were told to rotate it 120 degrees clockwise, we would take their response and then rotated it back 120 degrees counterclockwise, and this was what we would term the subject's guess. And so we were wondering, you know, if subjects really rotated a guess location, then we may be able to decode this guess location. And this is quite surprisingly, actually, indeed, what we found. For scene trials, as you can see here, again, not surprisingly, we can decode the guessed location of the target. You know, obviously, for scene trials, and subjects performed very well when they saw the target, these are highly correlated, so the time courses, the decoding time courses look very similar here. But even for the unseen trials, we were able to retrieve a decodable representation of the subject's guess even before the presentation of the rotation cue. And so, of course, these are now averages across subjects. So this jitter in time is potentially due to different subjects, you know, retrieving or making a guess at slightly different points in time, or, you know, even individual subjects doing it differently across different trials. But what seems to be the case is that at some point during this initial period, subjects guessed a location and then applied a conscious rotation to this guessed location. And this is actually quite striking because we're able to decode a representation here that is not at all a sensory representation that our subject has received, right? This is purely an image that they held in their mind and a thought that occurred to them. So this is quite striking, actually. And then what is very nice as well is that as this representation of the guest location sort of seems to slowly fade away, we see a ramp and a rise of the decodability of the response location, which perhaps suggests that what subjects are doing is really a very analog process in which they rotate one location through intermediate steps into this response location. And this is the very last analysis that I would like to share with you. This now is for the scene trials. And essentially what you're seeing are the decoder estimates on each, well, the averages of these, but on each trial, the estimates, the histograms of the decoder estimates that are decoder produced as a function of whether or not the target was rotated clockwise, counterclockwise, or not at all. What you're seeing is that before the presentation of the rotation cue, and not surprisingly, these estimates are all centered on the actual target location. But as the cue was presented, these tend to diverge towards the correct response location, passing through the intermediate locations that would have been necessary to do this rotation. And of course, big caveat here, these are averages over trials. So, you know, I don't know what happens at the single trial level, but at least over the average of many trials, it looks like as if subjects are going through intermediate steps in order to rotate the target. And this is also true for the unseen trials, but much more noisy in that case. Okay, and with this being said, I hope that I could convince you, A, that consciousness really is a scientifically tractable and interesting problem to study, that MVPA can help us in neuroscience to provide a unique window into the temporal evolution of both conscious and potentially non-conscious thoughts, and that indeed what we're looking at is a genuine non-conscious maintenance of information, but not a genuine non-conscious working memory system, because it's missing this crucial aspect of being able to manipulate the information non-consciously. And yeah, with this being said, I would like to thank you all for your attention and all of my collaborators for their hard work, without whom, this project would not have been possible at all. And in particular, I would like to point out Sébastien Marty and Stanislas Dehaene. Thanks a lot.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much for an awesome talk. I think it goes without saying that it's there are multiple papers out there that say, oh, like, let's try to decode a particular let's say mental state, but the fact that you were actually able to show it degrade and track it over time, I think it's absolutely fascinating. So
thank you
for that. I will ask the audience to send questions my way. I'll keep an eye on that.
Okay.
And I have a couple of questions here for you. So first, I saw that there are different analysis techniques. So there was the you did Bayesian stats, you did frequentist stats, and you did decoding. And I think a common interest with like people that are essentially on the stream, like trying to use the ideal tool in order to get access to neural data specifically. So what do you think, like, what made you choose between them? Just like very general, top level.
Well, we try to analyze our data as fully as possible, if you will. So, a lot of the analyses that we're trying to do are very subtle, and so typical univariate contrasts between different conditions are probably not going to reveal the full picture. Tracking the contents of working memory is not easily possible in a univariate sort of setting. So we always try, well, the way we approach our data is to always make sure initially that we're able to replicate well-known phenomena and findings, which usually involve some sort of univariate analysis. So we're contrasting seen and unseen trials, seeing if we can get the P3B and so forth. But then, since we're really interested in the evolution of mental processes, we tend to turn to decoding and try to get a better grip on this. And of course, we're nowhere near experts, I would say, in this domain. So we try to make, we always try to find ways to get the most out of fairly limited data. Because I should also probably say that, of course, unfortunately, neuroimaging is very expensive. So we're almost never in a position that we have hundreds of subjects, thousands of trials, so we have a limited number of subjects, a limited number of trials, and then we try to, analyze our data and also corroborate findings from different aspects. I would never present a finding that, is not consistent with other analyses that I've done before. So, yeah. Does that answer your question?
I do believe so. I think one thing that you typically see nowadays is that a person just finds, okay, like, we're going to use machine learning for this particular study, and they stick with it the whole way, even though maybe you do need a little bit of stats here. Maybe you do need a little bit of Bayesian stats to fulfill that piece. So so the second question is more on the neuroscience and neurophysiology side. So you reference the P3B effect, which is the effect that you see in like 300 to 600 milliseconds. And you point to that as one of the main components that get elicited as part of this working memory and storing things. That is, so I come at it from a completely different perspective, where a P3B tends to be attention, and like you just being like, oh yeah, that's the one I'm looking for. So from your experience and the work you've done in the multiple papers, do you think it's the same phenomenon, or the same ERP, or the same source, or it's just the same manifestation for completely different mechanisms?
That's a good question. I think people are, depending on the literature, as you said, you may, find lots of different descriptors for the P3B. I think the phenomenon that we're studying is probably the same. So, I mean, it's fairly well defined in time and topography. Of course, I should add, I haven't used EEG here. It was MEG, so technically okay. Yeah, but let's so let's assume it's the P3B. We tend to, I mean, this is one of the most consistent signatures of conscious processing that we find in pretty much any paradigm that we run. When you contrast seen and unseen trials, this is what we tend to find. But this is not to say that it only that is only a marker of conscious processing. I see how, first of all, I would argue that in general, in neuroscience, it's sometimes very difficult to tease apart the different labels that we give to different cognitive functions. So someone may say they study attention, but it's actually very much related to what I'm doing. Of course, attention and conscious perception in general, I think, are very closely related cognitive functions. And I would argue that you need, attention is sort of a precursor to consciousness, if you will, a gateway. But so yeah, I think we're looking at the same phenomenon. The question is, what is really the most low-level sort of description or explanation you could give for the P3B that perhaps is common to all of these different paradigms that we're using that tend to elicit the P3B.
Right. No, very good. Thank you. So I have a question here from Amir. So the question is, I suppose most of the data is very noisy. How reproducible are results like these? I mean, yeah, neurophysiological data are very noisy, but how do you go about doing that? And I also, like, how do you make sure that it's above chance, and especially that this is single trial as well? So
yes. So of course, what I'm presenting. So there are two things. Several things. So yes, by necessity, these data are going to be very noisy, right? So we can do our best to minimize the noise as much as possible. But of course, we have different subjects. We have a scanner that, has to pick up very sensitive brain activity. So unfortunately, there is not much that we can do about that. So what we try to do is, get as many trials, repetitions, and subjects as we possibly can, because when you do the same sort of analysis over multiple subjects and trials, then that gives you a much better idea. Of course, we also try to internally, of course, replicate our findings. So a lot of the findings that I have presented to you today, for example, were replicated in several studies. So it was not just one data set, it's multiple data sets. As I've said before, we also try to make sure for each data set that we tend to find well-known effects, such as the P3B. If I didn't find the P3B in these data, I would be very worried. So I never start with the most high-level, challenging analysis. I really start from the ground up, and I make sure that I meet all the different requirements. And then, of course, in our case, we've simulated our paradigm with an artificial neural network, which lends credibility to the results that we found. And of course, if you talk about specifically the activity silent aspect of this project, of course, this is one major open question that we still don't know, because by definition, MEG does not record activity silent activity, right? It records neural activity. So this is by inference, by using models, theory, and by really having tried very, very hard. As I said at the set out, for years, we were trying to find decoding of unseen target locations. We've tried many different things. We were just unsuccessful. I guess, or we never found anything. And, modeling then seems to support that at least what we're proposing is a plausible neural mechanism for non-conscious information storage.
Excellent. So I wish we had a lot more time. I wish we had more time to discuss. But I just would really want to thank you for your time and the great presentation. I'm going to make sure that, because I already have some requests for the slides, I'm going to make sure that I get the slides online, and the recording is going to be on the YouTube channel and the website. So thank you. For everybody that's for everybody that has joined us the first time today, all the content is going to be online. Thank you very much for joining us today, and Darinka, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you.